We've all been there. You drop a V6 into your favourite box expecting a huge speed increase, get into final gear, and up until now you need to delve into the Assetto Corsa data files to tweak the gearing, but to save myself and others the pain of messing around with text editors, I've now updated Engine Crane so that it allows you to change the gearing of your cars so you can go from this to this without touching a single text file. First up, we need to understand gear setup in Assetto Corsa. I've spent some time researching this and have found that there are 3 ways in which gearing can work in cars. They can have set fixed ratios. In this case, the gear tab of the setup screen doesn't allow any modifications. They can have sets of ratios which allow switching between the predefined sets, but no per gear alterations are allowed. Or each gear can be customizable, and you can select between a list of ratios for each of them. In addition to this, cars will either have a fixed or a configurable final drive ratio. This is all very well and good, but what do these numbers on the setup screen mean? Well, each value represents a gear ratio, and these dictate how fast the wheels of the car go for each revolution of the engine. Jason on Engineering Explained has a great video describing how they work in detail, and I'll leave a link to that in the description. But for the impatient among you, here's an oversimplified crash course ignoring most complexities. We start with the engine. This runs at some number of revolutions per minute, or RPM, up to some maximum value that is usually determined by a rev limiter. This turns an output shaft that is connected into our gearbox. This contains all of our regular gears, the ones that you can shift up and down between whilst driving. Connected to this is the drive shaft, and connected to the other end of that, we have our final drive, which is ultimately connected to our wheels. In the setup menu, there are 2 different parameters which we are interested in: the ratios for each individual gear and the final drive ratio. We'll start by looking at the gears. The ratios for each gear will determine how much the drive shaft will turn for each engine revolution. Generally, we will have somewhere between 4 and 7 gears, which we can select as we drive. After that, we have the final drive. This will dictate how far the wheels will turn for each rotation of the drive shaft. This ratio is always the same regardless of what gear you're in. Descriptions can be helpful, but let's go through an example with some numbers. If you have a gear with a ratio value of 4, then this means that every time the engine output shaft rotates 4 times, the drive shaft will have rotated once. If your final drive ratio is 3, then for every 3 turns of the drive shaft, the wheels of the car will rotate once. These 2 ratios combined determine how much the car wheels will turn every time the engine does. We see that for every 4 turns of the engine, the drive shaft turns once, and then for every 3 turns of the drive shaft, we'll turn the wheels once. So this means that we can say every 4 times 3 turns of the engine, which will be 12, we will get 1 full turn of the wheels. If we were to change to a gear with a lower ratio, say 1, we can see that this changes things so that now we will only need 1 turn of the engine for 1 turn of the drive shaft. Our final drive hasn't changed, so we still need 3 turns of the drive shaft to turn the wheels once, so multiplying the ratios again, 1 by 3, shows that it now only takes 3 turns of the engine output shaft to turn the wheels once. The upshot of this is that because we now need fewer turns of the engine, 3 rather than 12, for 1 turn of the wheels, we can now travel further at any given RPM, meaning that we can reach a higher top speed. So you may be thinking at this point that this is much better. The engine has to spin less to turn the wheels. Why don't we always use lower gear ratios? Well, the downside of this lower ratio, at least simplistically speaking, is that the engine has to work much harder to turn the wheels. We say that it requires more torque. Because of this, it takes the engine longer to increase its RPM, meaning that ultimately we accelerate more slowly. Higher ratios, on the other hand, are easier to turn, so don't have this problem. An in-depth explanation of torque is somewhat outside the scope of this oversimplified example, but if you imagine trying to ride a bike from stationary in its highest gear, you'll find it much harder to turn the pedals than you would in a lower gear. This is because you need to apply more torque to get the wheels to move. If you'd like a more in-depth look at this, then I'd recommend checking out the Engineering Explained video I mentioned before. But back to our simple bike example, this brings us to one of the more potentially confusing things about the naming of gears. You'll notice I said it was harder to push a higher gear than a lower gear. This can seem counterintuitive at first because before I'd said that lower ratios were harder to turn. It sounds counterintuitive because of the way we go through the gears, from say first to sixth. We want our lower numbered gears, like first, to be easy to turn so we can accelerate quickly. So lower numbered gears generally have higher gear ratios. The opposite is then true for our higher numbered gears, say sixth. Here we want to be able to reach higher max speeds, so generally these will have lower gear ratios. This can catch people out because we're using the same terms, higher and lower, but in different contexts. So, as a high-level summary, the higher the ratio, the easier it is to turn, and the quicker the car will accelerate. But this comes at the cost of having a lower top speed because you need more turns of the engine for one turn of the wheel, and there's only so fast the engine can turn before you hit your rev limiter. These ratios will be used for gears like first and second, where acceleration is most important. The opposite applies for lower gear ratios. They are harder to turn, and so they accelerate more slowly, but because we need less turns of the engine for one turn of the wheels, it means that they will have a higher top speed, so we will generally use these in higher gears where this is more important. That's enough theory for now, I think. Let's go and put this into practice. Let's take a look at the ever popular AE86. This is the stock version in AC, and it's set up with fixed ratios that we can't modify. Let's see how it goes on the drag strip. Okay, the gears are tuned pretty well to the stock engine. Looks like we're nearly hitting the top of 5th at the 2k mark, just shy of 200 kph. Very respectable. I do think we can do a bit better though, so let's go ahead and swap in a modest engine upgrade. Modest upgrade in this case being a 500 odd horsepower V6. We'll keep the same gearing for now, and let's get back to the drag strip. Take 2. You can see she's a little feisty. Getting a little squirrely there. Our biggest problem now is that our gears are way too short, and with the new engine it means we're hitting the rev limiter almost immediately. Let's go ahead and try out Engine Crane's new party trick to see if we can improve our situation. Opening it up now, you'll see that there's a new Edit tab in the tab bar. On this new screen we can select any car in our AC install that we've previously engine swapped. So let's go ahead and select our new V6 AE86. Now it's selected, you'll see we have access to the car's gear setup data. All of this is now available to us for editing. We can edit the ratios for the individual gears, add or remove final drive ratios, or even change between the setup types that I mentioned at the start of the video. For now, let's try changing to the gear sets option, and to start with, let's add in a lower final drive. When adding a new ratio, you can give it a name, but you can also just leave it blank and it will get auto-populated for you. Let's add in another ratio in between those two so we have a couple of different settings to play around with. Okay, let's go ahead and add in a new gear set with some lower ratios all round. Okay, I think I'm happy with that for now. To make these changes stick, all we need to do is hit the apply button in the top left. We should get a little notification that tells us it's done. Excellent. Everything looks good. Let's go test it out. Back over to the drag strip, and in the gear setup tab we should now see our new options. We've got the choice of either the original gear setup or the new one that we've just added. In addition to this, we've now got our new final drive ratios to choose between. So let's go ahead and just change the final drive for now. You can see that this increases the max speed in each gear to something that looks a bit more fitting for our V6. Success! This setup is much more appropriate for our new engine. We've got about 100 kph top speed improvement to show for it, so I'd say that's pretty good work. To prove that it also works, let's switch our gear set to the new one that we added and show that in action. For this, we'll set the final drive back to the default and see what effect we get when we only change the gears. I think it would be fair to call that a success too. While we're here, let's show off a few of the other things you can do with the Edit tab. You can add and remove gears. The limit in Assetto Corsa is 10 gears. If you want to do your best Fast and Furious impression, this is the way to do it. Let's try adding a 6th gear with some longer ratios. You know what, let's also make each gear configurable to show what that looks like in the Setup tab. Just for good measure, let's add in another ratio for 6th as well. Back in the Setup menu, and you can now see our new 6th gear, as well as being able to configure each gear individually. Let's have a quick look at what that 6th gear looks like. Just to prove my previous comment that lower ratios aren't always better, let's do a little experiment showing what happens when we choose the lowest ratio combinations possible. AC is rather optimistically telling us we're going to get to 449 km per hour, which for context would make it the 4th fastest car in the world. You can see that we didn't even make it into 6th gear, so I think that unequivocally proves that lower ratios aren't always better. This is a note of caution about the max speed numbers shown in the setup menu. Finally, I'll show one last option that you can mess around with. By default, the Edit tab will only let you choose cars that you've engine swapped previously. The idea of this is to save you from yourself and prevent you accidentally editing any of the stock AC cars. There is an override for this behaviour with the Show All Cars checkbox, but be warned, if you were to edit one of the stock cars and tried to go online with it, then you'd be instantly kicked with a checksum validation error. A message will pop up warning you this if you try to enable the option. If you're finished and know what you're doing, then you can always dismiss this pop-up and you'll be able to edit any car in your AC install. Please note, I take no responsibility for any broken cars. Come for the modding, stay for the doggo. It was International Dogs Day this weekend and it happens to fall on my dog's birthday, so here he is being a very good boy. If you'd like to see more modding or good boy content in the future, boot the snoot to subscribe and share with anyone else you know who enjoys modding AC. Either way, have a good day, and I'll try to bring the next update a little sooner. See ya!